"Get out of that seat, or I will have security drag you off this aircraft myself." The gate agent's voice did not shake. She wanted everyone in the first-class cabin to hear it, and they did. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman in a cream scarf stopped adjusting her armrest. And in seat 1A, a man in a plain charcoal jacket and scuffed brown boots did not move at all. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I paid for this seat. Sir, this is your final warning. Stand up, or I call the marshal." "Then call him," the man said. "But before you do, ask yourself one question. What happens to your job when he asks to see my boarding pass?" Nobody in that cabin knew it yet. But Meridian Air was about to lose the one relationship that kept half its airplanes in the sky. And it was about to lose it over an argument about who was allowed to sit in a chair. Rewind 50 minutes to a gray Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson International, and none of this had happened yet. Nathaniel Cross moved through Concourse E, the way he moved through every airport in the country. Like a man who had already made his money and had nothing left to prove to anyone standing in a security line. He was 51 years old, 6'1", with graying stubble he never quite got around to shaving all the way off. He wore the same thing he wore to board meetings that didn't matter. A charcoal jacket over a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, boots that had crossed 3 continents and never been polished once. No watch, no rings, just a battered leather duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a small object in his jacket pocket that he touched, with noticing he was doing it every few minutes. A silver pocket watch, cracked glass face. Stopped at 447. It had belonged to his father, Elijah Cross, who spent 31 years loading luggage onto the belly of airplanes for a regional carrier that no longer existed. Elijah used to say that airports were the most honest places in America because they showed you exactly who people thought mattered and who they thought didn't. And they showed it to you in under 60 seconds, before anyone said a word. Nathaniel had never forgotten the day his father came home with a torn uniform sleeve and said nothing about it for 6 years. He found out later, from an old coworker at the funeral, that a supervisor had grabbed Elijah by that sleeve in front of 40 passengers and told him he was moving too slow to be trusted around expensive luggage. Elijah never filed a complaint. Men like Elijah didn't file complaints. They just kept loading bags, and they kept a photograph of their son's college acceptance letter taped inside their locker, and they died at 63, having never once been told they mattered. Nathaniel built Ironclad Dynamics 11 years later. Today, it was the company that quietly ran the crew scheduling, maintenance tracking, and gate assignment software for 6 major airlines, including the one whose logo was printed on the boarding pass, currently folded in his hand. Meridian Air did not know that the software keeping its dispatch towers from collapsing into chaos every single morning belonged to a man who still flew coach when nobody was forcing him into first class. Just to see how his father's world still treated people who looked like he did. Today, his assistant had booked him first class. Long flight, back-to-back board meetings waiting on the other end. Seat 1A. His phone buzzed as he reached the gate. A message from Simone Baxter, his chief operating officer, Meridian contract renewal signed. 14 months of work. "Congratulations, boss." He read it twice. 14 months of legal reviews, system audits, late-night calls, with executives who needed him more than they liked admitting it. He slipped the phone into his pocket, felt the watch beside it, and walked down the jet bridge into the quiet hum of a plane that had no idea who had just boarded it. Keep that watch in your mind. It is going to matter more than you think, and not in the way you expect. The first-class cabin smelled like recycled air and warm bread, ivory leather seats, soft overhead light. In seat 3C, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Sable, 74 years old, adjusted a paperback novel on her lap and watched the boarding line with the patient eyes of a woman who had spent 42 years reading children, before they learned how to hide their cruelty. She noticed Nathaniel the moment he stepped through the curtain. Not because of his clothes, because of the way the flight attendant's smile changed shape when she looked at his boarding pass. "Seat 1A, the flight attendant said, her voice cooling by 2 full degrees. Her name tag read Chloe Ransom. "Right this way, sir." Nathaniel settled into the window seat, stowed his duffel, and closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds of peace. It lasted 4 seconds. "Excuse me, that's my seat." The voice belonged to a man who expected rooms to reorganize themselves the instant he entered them. Preston Vance, 61, silver at the temples, a cashmere overcoat draped over one arm like a trophy. He had flown this exact route to Charlotte 41 times in the last 3 years, always in 1A, and he had built an entire private mythology around the idea that the seat belonged to him the way certain men believe golf courses and country clubs belong to them. Not by ownership, but by the accumulated weight of expectation. He stared at Nathaniel the way you stare at a stain on a white tablecloth. "Sir, I think there's some confusion," Chloe said quickly, appearing at Preston's elbow like she'd been summoned by his displeasure. "Let me sort this out." Nathaniel didn't move. "There's no confusion. This is my seat. Here's my pass." Chloe glanced at it. Barely. The way you glance at evidence you've already decided to ignore. "Mr. Vance is one of our most valued flyers," she said, lowering her voice as if that made the sentence smaller. "He normally sits here on this route." "Normally," Nathaniel repeated. "Yes, but not today." Dorothy Sable lowered her book by exactly 1 inch. Preston exhaled through his nose. The sound of a man deciding patience was a gift he was choosing to extend. "Look, this doesn't need to be a whole production. I fly this route every week. The crew knows me. Just take 3 seats. Same cabin, same drinks. Nobody has to make this difficult." "My boarding pass says 1A, Nathaniel said. "Yours doesn't." Something shifted in Preston's face. A flicker, gone in half a second, that Dorothy recognized instantly, because she'd seen it 1,000 times in faculty meetings. It was the look of a man realizing, for the first time in years, that someone was not going to simply absorb his inconvenience and disappear. Chloe's tablet trembled slightly in her hand. "Sir," she said to Nathaniel, "I'm only asking for a little flexibility." "Flexibility," Nathaniel said, "is the word people use right before they ask the wrong person to pay for someone else's comfort." The cabin had gone very quiet. Not silent. A businessman, 2 rows back, had stopped pretending to read his phone. A young couple across the aisle had gone still, the way people go still when they sense a room deciding something without a vote. Chloe's supervisor was 3 rows away, and Chloe knew exactly what would happen if she let this become a scene that reached him. So she did what people like Chloe often do when they are more afraid of conflict than they are committed to fairness. She reached for the nuclear option, hoping it would end things quickly. "Sir, if you can't cooperate, I'll need to bring in our cabin manager." "Then bring him," Nathaniel said. She did, and that decision is the one Meridian Air would spend the next 72 hours regretting. Grant Delaney walked into first class like a man who had built his entire identity around never once being wrong in front of a passenger. 44 years old, ex-military posture, a uniform pressed so precisely it looked laminated. He took one look at the scene. An older, black man in a plain jacket, sitting calmly by the window. A silver-haired white man in cashmere, standing in the aisle with his arms crossed. And he made his decision in under 2 seconds, the way men like Grant always did, without knowing they were making it at all. "Good afternoon, folks," he said, and smiled first at Preston. Preston's shoulders relaxed instantly. Nathaniel got no smile at all. "Just a clip, sir. May I see your documentation?" Documentation. Not Preston's. His. Dorothy Sable set her book down entirely now. "You already have it," Nathaniel said. "Miss Ransom confirmed it 30 seconds ago." Grant glanced at Chloe. Chloe looked at her shoes. "There may have been a mix-up with the seating chart," Grant said. We'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade to our premium cabin on your return flight, and seat 3C for this leg. Same service. What seat is Mr. Vance assigned? Nathaniel asked. Silence. What seat? Nathaniel said again. Slower. Is Mr. Vance assigned? Grant's jaw tightened. He looked at the tablet in Chloe's hand, like it had personally betrayed him. 2C, Chloe admitted barely above a whisper. Then Mr. Vance's seat is 2C. Watch what happens in the next 90 seconds, because this is where a disagreement about airline seating becomes something else entirely. Something that will end with 2 federal agents, a viral video, and a man's entire career folding in on itself in less than 4 days. Preston's face reddened, not with embarrassment. With something closer to fury, the fury of a man discovering that the rules he'd always assumed bent around him did not, in fact, bend at all. You know what your problem is? Preston said, stepping closer. Close enough that Dorothy half rose from her seat without meaning to. People like you always think everything's a fight. I offered you a perfectly good seat, and you're turning this into a circus because you enjoy the attention. People like me, Nathaniel repeated softly. You know exactly what I mean. Say it then. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out, because there is a sentence sitting behind that phrase that even Preston Vance, in front of 40 witnesses, was not quite reckless enough to say out loud. But everyone in that cabin heard it anyway. They heard it in the silence where the words should have been. Grant, sensing the ground shifting under a story he no longer controlled, made his second mistake of the day. Instead of ending it, he doubled down. Sir, he said to Nathaniel, his voice sharpening now, official and cold, your continued refusal to cooperate is becoming a disruption to this flight. If you do not comply, I will have no choice but to have you removed. There it was, the exact sentence that opened this story. A seated passenger with a valid ticket, sitting quietly, asking only to keep the seat he'd purchased 3 weeks earlier, reclassified in real time as a threat to the operation of the aircraft. Nathaniel placed both hands flat on the armrests. Say that again. Sir, I need you to gather your belongings. You said my refusal to cooperate is creating a disruption. I want you to tell this entire cabin, out loud, exactly what I refused to do. Grant's throat worked. You refused a reasonable seat reassignment. Reasonable for whom? Nobody answered. Outside the window, a maintenance truck rolled past in the gray Atlanta light, and for 1 full second, the entire first-class cabin held its breath together. Dorothy Sable stood up. She was 74 years old, 4'11" in flat shoes, and she planted herself in the aisle like a woman who had broken up 1,000 playground fights and had exactly 0 patience left for adult versions of the same cruelty. He has the ticket, she said. The other gentleman does not. I taught school for 42 years, and I know exactly what this is, so don't you dare call it a seating issue in front of me. Grant's professional smile cracked at the edge. Ma'am, please take your seat. We have this handled. No, Dorothy said. You very clearly do not. A phone came up in row 2. Then another, in the row behind it, angled low but recording. Chloe saw the small red light reflected in someone's sunglasses and felt something cold drop straight through her stomach, because she understood, in that instant, that this was no longer a disagreement that would stay inside this airplane. Grant saw it too. And here is his third mistake, the one that would matter most in 72 hours. Instead of de-escalating, he leaned toward the intercom on the bulkhead and said the 6 words that would end his career. I need law enforcement to gate. Preston, emboldened now that authority had chosen a side, smiled for the first time since he'd boarded. Finally, he muttered, Some order. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He reached into his duffel bag, slowly enough that Grant's hand twitched toward his radio, and pulled out a single black leather folder. Thin, unremarkable. He set it on his tray table without opening it. Before your officers arrive, Nathaniel said, I want everyone in this cabin to understand something clearly, because in about 4 minutes, several strangers with badges are going to walk in here and decide who the problem is before they ask a single question. I have not raised my voice. I have not left my seat. I have not touched another passenger. I have shown my boarding pass 3 times to 3 different employees, and every one of you confirmed it was correct. And still, I am the one about to be removed from this aircraft in handcuffs. He looked directly at Grant. Ask yourself what that says about how this airline decides who belongs. 2 gate agents in navy blazers stepped through the curtain, followed by an airport security officer whose hand rested lightly on his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough that 3 passengers gasped anyway. Chloe Ransom pointed without being asked directly at seat 1A. Frozen, no one moved. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere behind the curtain, a coffee machine hissed and finished its cycle, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in a cabin where 40 people had stopped breathing at the same time. The officer looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the folder on the tray table. He looked, for 1/2 second too long, at the color of Nathaniel's skin against the cream leather seat, and everyone watching understood exactly what conclusion he had already reached before opening his mouth. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft with me." "On what charge?" "Failure to comply with crew instruction." "Which instruction did I fail to comply with?" The officer's eyes flicked to Grant. Grant said nothing, because there was nothing true to say. Nathaniel opened the folder. Inside was a single printed page, a contract summary dated 11 months earlier, bearing 2 names at the top, Ironclad Dynamics and Meridian Air. Below it, a signature line. Below that, the words Enterprise Operations Platform, Crew Scheduling, Maintenance Tracking, Gate Systems, Full Fleet Integration. "I was hoping to fly home today as just a passenger," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's all I wanted. But since your airline has decided I don't belong in the seat I paid for, I think it's time everyone here learns exactly whose software is keeping this airplane's departure board from collapsing right now." Chloe's hand rose to her mouth. Grant's face lost its color 1 shade at a time, the way paper loses color in sunlight. The officer looked down at the page, and then back up at Nathaniel, with the particular horror of a man realizing he was 30 seconds from arresting the person who quietly kept his airline's entire operation from falling apart. "That's not possible," Preston said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You? You're telling me you? I built the dispatch system your flight is using right now to know which gate it's parked at," Nathaniel said. "I built the maintenance log that told this aircraft it was safe to fly this morning. I have flown coach on this airline 11 times this year, Mr. Vance, specifically to see how it treats people who don't look important. Today, I flew first class for the first time in 8 months. 40 minutes later, I'm being threatened with removal in handcuffs." His phone buzzed on the tray table. The screen lit up. Renata Kessler, Meridian Antrim CEO, he let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Nobody in that cabin spoke. Then he picked it up, pressed the screen, and set it down on the tray table on speaker. "Renata." "Nathaniel, what in God's name is happening on Flight 219? I have 3 people in my office, watching a live stream of security walking toward your seat. I'm being removed from an aircraft I have a valid, paid ticket for," Nathaniel said, "because your crew decided a repeat flyer's preference outweighed my boarding pass. And when I asked them to correct it, your cabin manager called it a disruption and requested law enforcement." There was a silence on the line that felt like the entire building on the other end had stopped breathing. "Put the officer on," Renata said. The security officer took the phone with visible reluctance. "This is Renata Kessler, Interim Chief Executive of Meridian Air. Is there any safety violation that requires this passenger's removal?" "No, ma'am." "Is there any federal regulation he has violated?" "No, ma'am." "Is seat 1A validly assigned to him?" A pause. Yes, ma'am. Then you will apologize to Mr. Cross, you will return to your post, and you will file a report stating clearly that no violation occurred. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am. Renata's voice did not soften until she asked to speak to Nathaniel again. I am so sorry. I don't yet know everything that happened, but I know enough to know it shouldn't have happened at all. You'll know everything in about 4 minutes, Nathaniel said, because 40 passengers are recording this on their phones right now, and at least 6 of them have already started uploading. The line went quiet in a different way this time. The quiet of someone doing math they did not want to do. Preston Vance stood in the aisle with his cashmere coat still folded over one arm, and, for the first time since he'd boarded, he looked like a man who understood, slowly and with great reluctance, that the story he'd walked into was not the one he thought he was standing in. I want it. On record, Renata said through the speaker, loud enough for the whole cabin, that Mr. Vance's loyalty status with this airline is suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review of this incident. Mr. Delaney, you are relieved of cabin duties for the remainder of this flight. Miss Ransom, please preserve every piece of crew communication from boarding. No edits, no summaries. I want the complete, unaltered record. Chloe's voice cracked. Yes, ma'am. Preston finally spoke, and his voice had lost every ounce of the authority it carried 40 minutes earlier. This is absurd. I've flown with this airline for 2 decades. You're going to suspend my status over a seat? No, Mr. Vance, Renata said. I'm suspending it because you demanded a man surrender a seat he paid for, and when he refused, you stood by while my crew tried to have him arrested. That is not about a seat. You know that. Everyone on that aircraft knows that. Preston opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Dorothy Sable, still standing in the aisle, looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt. Something closer to disappointment, the specific kind, reserved for a student who had every advantage in the world and chose, again and again, to waste it on cruelty. You should sit down, Mr. Vance, she said, in your seat, 2C. He sat down. His hands, for the first time all morning, were not steady. Nathaniel closed the folder, slid it back into his bag, and looked out the window at the gray Atlanta runway. Rain had started, thin lines sliding down the glass. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the specific exhaustion that comes from winning an argument that should never have needed winning at all. The same exhaustion, he realized, that his father must have carried home in that torn uniform sleeve 30 years earlier and never once spoken about. He touched the pocket watch through his jacket. Still stopped at 4:47. Still his father's. Still the reason he flew coach 11 times a year just to check. Keep watching, because the story does not end with an apology on a phone. It ends with what happens 3 days later, when the video crosses 2 million views, and Meridian Air discovers exactly how much quiet grace a man had been extending to them long before anyone knew his name. The aircraft pushed back from the gate 40 minutes late. Grant Delaney stood near the galley for the remainder of the flight, staring at nothing, running through a mental list of every training module he'd completed on de-escalation and inclusion, and realizing that not one of them had prepared him for the moment. His own assumptions were placed under bright light and recorded from 12 different angles. Chloe Ransom kept her eyes on her tablet and did not look at seat 1A again. In seat 2C, Preston Vance stared at his phone screen without reading anything on it, his thumb hovering, his jaw working slowly, grinding humiliation into something that had not yet decided whether it was anger or shame. Dorothy Sable returned to her paperback but did not read a single page for the rest of the flight. Instead, she watched Nathaniel Cross sit quietly by the window with an untouched glass of water on his tray table, and she thought about the hundreds of children she had spent 4 decades protecting from smaller, quieter versions of exactly this cruelty, and how the world's rules only ever mattered as much as the willingness of the people in forcing them to apply those rules to everyone equally. 6 hours later, in a glass conference room at Meridian Air's Charlotte headquarters, Renata Kessler sat at the head of a long table, watching a phone screen that would not stop lighting up. Beside her, Operations Vice President Harlan Boyd stared at a coffee cup he had forgotten to drink from. Across the table, Communications Director Priya Anand turned her laptop around to show a video that had already crossed 400,000 views in under 3 hours. The clip that had spread fastest was 11 seconds long. A calm man in a charcoal jacket, sitting in seat 1A, saying quietly, "Ask yourself what that says about how this airline decides who belongs." Harlan closed his eyes. "God help us." "No," Renata said. "God already showed us the problem. Now we find out whether we have the courage to actually fix it." Her phone rang again, legal, then the board. Then a red alert bloomed silently across Harlan's laptop screen. "Crew scheduling sync delayed, Southeast region." He frowned and leaned forward. Another alert appeared beneath it. "Maintenance dashboard refresh failure, fleet-wide." Then a third, "Gate assignment lag, Atlanta hub." The room went very cold very quickly. "Is this Cross?" Renata asked. Harlan's fingers moved across the keyboard. "They're not down," he said slowly. "They haven't cut us off. They're just not accelerating support beyond the baseline service terms in the contract anymore." Priya swallowed hard. "So they're doing exactly what we're contractually owed." "Nothing more." "Yes." Renata leaned back in her chair, and the full weight of what that meant settled over her slowly, like water finding the lowest point in a room. It was not sabotage. It was not revenge. It was simply the quiet withdrawal of 11 months of goodwill that ironclad dynamics had extended to Meridian Air far beyond what any contract required. The 2A.M. patches, the holiday weekend fixes, the small miracles nobody in this room had ever thanked anyone for, because nobody in this room had known there was anyone to thank. "Get Boyd's team drafting a formal apology," Renata said. "Not the kind our lawyers write. The kind that means something. I want it ready by tomorrow morning, and I want it delivered in person." 3 days later, Renata Kessler sat across from Nathaniel Cross in a small conference room at the Ironclad Dynamics office in Atlanta. And there were no cameras, no lawyers, no board members, just 2 people and a folder of documents she had spent the last 72 hours reviewing personally. "I read every recording," she said. "Every crew statement, every second of footage that's been posted publicly. And I want you to know I understand exactly what happened. You were treated as a threat in a seat you were legally, contractually, unmistakably entitled to sit in, and every single person involved believed, right up until the moment they were proven wrong, that they were the reasonable ones." Nathaniel said nothing. He let her keep going. "Preston Vance's loyalty status has been permanently revoked. Grant Delaney has been removed from all passenger-facing roles and will not be reinstated. Chloe Ransom has been suspended pending a full retraining review. And I've asked our board to fund a company-wide audit of how we train every single employee on de-escalation, on documentation, and frankly, on who we assume belongs where." "It's not enough," Nathaniel said quietly. "I know. It was never about the apology. I know that too." Renata's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. "It was about who this company decided deserved that seat before anyone knew your name." Silence filled the small room. Outside the window, Atlanta traffic moved 12 floors below, cars carrying people who had no idea any of this had happened. People having the best day of their lives and the worst day of their lives on the very same afternoon, the way cities always do. "There's something else," Renata said. "During the review, we found 4 other complaints filed over the last 3 years involving Grant Delaney and passengers of color being reassigned out of paid seats. All 4 were closed without action. All 4 had been marked passenger misunderstanding." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I'm reopening all 4, Renata said, "and I'm personally calling each of those passengers myself." 2 weeks later, Meridian Air announced new company-wide seating dispute protocols, mandatory documented review for every reassignment request, and a public commitment to an independent audit of how customer complaints involving discrimination had been historically handled. None of that made the news the way the original video had. What made the news was 11 seconds of a calm man asking one question nobody in that cabin could answer. Preston Vance did not go quietly. For 2 weeks he told anyone who would listen that he was the real victim, that the airline had caved to a viral mob, that his 4 decades of loyalty meant nothing anymore. But the board of the private equity firm where he served as a limited partner had also seen the video, and 3 days after Meridian's public statement, they quietly informed him his advisory role would not be renewed. His golf club, the one that had featured him in its spring newsletter 18 months earlier under the headline "A Valued Member," made no further mention of him at all. He kept telling the story his way at dinner parties for a while. Slowly, fewer people wanted to hear it. Grant Delaney sent a letter, eventually. Not through a lawyer. Through the mail in his own handwriting, addressed directly to Nathaniel's office. It said, in part, that he had spent every night, since the incident, replaying the moment. He'd looked at Preston Vance and smiled first, and Nathaniel Cross and asked for documentation, and that he had finally understood, far too late, that he had made that choice in less than 2 seconds without ever once questioning why. Nathaniel read it twice and did not respond, and did not need to. Some apologies exist for the person writing them, not the person receiving them, and that is allowed to be true too. 6 months later, Nathaniel Cross flew Meridian Air again. No announcement, no cameras, no special treatment requested or offered. He wore the same charcoal jacket, the same scuffed boots, the same silver pocket watch stopped at 4:47, sitting quietly in his pocket. At the boarding door stood a young flight attendant he had never met, whose name tag read Imani. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cross," she said, and it was not the smile people give to money, and it was not the smile people give to power. It was the smile people give to another human being, simply because they are one. "Good to be here," Nathaniel said, and meant it. He sat down in seat 1A. Outside the window, the Atlanta sky had cleared, gold light spilling across the wings of the aircraft. Somewhere in a filing cabinet at Meridian's Charlotte headquarters, 4 reopened complaints were finally being read for the first time by someone who intended to do something about them. Somewhere in Ohio, or maybe it was Georgia, or maybe it did not matter exactly where, an elderly retired teacher named Dorothy Sable sat with a cup of tea and thought about a man who had done nothing except sit quietly in the seat he'd already paid for, and about how long it had taken the world around him to notice that quiet was never the same thing as weak. Nathaniel touched the watch in his pocket one more time before the plane began to move. Because respect, he had learned a long time ago from a man who loaded suitcases for 31 years, and never once raised his voice about it, should never have to wait for someone to prove who they are. It should simply begin with the fact that they are a person, sitting in the seat that is rightfully theirs. And for the first time in a very long time, seat 1A finally felt like nothing more than a seat.